Absolutely devastating. I'll never forget being in the ICU and hearing the way his dad cried out when entering the room and seeing his son laying unconscious, basically in a coma, before he passed away. Can scrolling on social media have the same effect on the brain as doing hard drugs like crystal meth?
Caution, the following contains graphic depictions of drug use that some viewers may find triggering or disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
I smoked crystal meth every day for a year, and needless to say, the effects it has on the body and brain are not ideal. Now that it's in the past, it's easy for me to look back and say that while it was an unbearable experience to come out of, it actually ended up being one of the most important learning experiences of my life. Looking back, I can see that I didn't realize how much I was learning about a crucial function of the brain that affects so much of our decision making as adults. It was 2012 when I was introduced to meth, and it felt so good in ways that I can't even describe that right away I knew I was in trouble and was gonna have a really hard time stopping. It was so bad that I was actually sleeping with my meth pipe under my pillow because I wanted the first thing to do when waking up and last thing before going to bed was take one more hit. Before I go any further, I just want to say if you might be triggered by this type of content, please consider not watching this video anymore. If you or someone you know is in distress related to addiction, please reach out to your local resources for support. If you need help finding resources, you can reach out to the National Substance Abuse Hotline. For me, addiction was a slippery slope and one of the more scary experiences I've had in my life. I was so addicted to meth that sadly, sleeping with my pipe every night was not even the most bizarre aspect of my behavior at that time. At the peak of my addiction, I was a team leader for a door-to-door sales company, and I would purposefully plan my door-knocking routes around my own house. In the past, we would get to drive out to new cities and go on road trips, but now I was strategically keeping us in the same area within a 20-minute radius of the house that I lived in. That way, I could drop everyone off to knock on doors and go home and smoke throughout the day. I needed the supply in my system constantly, so driving too far away meant I would start going through withdrawals. I also noticed my awareness of my surroundings was gradually changing the longer I used. I wasn't just zombied out, I was confused and disoriented during interactions with other people. I kept hearing myself say things that didn't make sense and finding myself feeling embarrassed or confused after conversations I'd had in public or various social settings. There is nothing exciting or glamorous about that life. Yes, the drug obviously makes a person feel really good temporarily, which is why people keep going back to it, but it can absolutely devastate lives quickly. One of my roommates who I used to use regularly with used to say, "Look man, I've been doing this a lot longer than you, and let me just tell you that when you're in this, your life starts flying by. You use drugs and you wake up one day and years have gone by and you don't know where the time went. Suddenly you're older and you can't fathom how your life got away from you." He would always tell me that it was too late for him, but if that he could give me any advice, it would be to stop using as soon as I can. That friend of mine ended up passing away a couple of years after that after complications occurred at a hospital in response to him overdosing on multiple drugs, including meth. Absolutely devastating. I'll never forget being in the ICU and hearing the way his dad cried out when entering the room and seeing his son laying unconscious, basically in a coma, before he passed away. If you're struggling with addiction, please seek out resources and support or go to a free 12-step meeting if you can. There are free 12-step programs all over the country available both in person and virtually. Now, what does this have to do with doom scrolling? I know some viewers might scratch their heads and wonder if I'm really comparing hard drugs to being on social media. Well, yes, I am. But before I explain why, I'm happy to share that I haven't touched meth since March of 2013 and will celebrate 12 years as of today, March 7th, 2025, the day that I'm actually filming this video. I also quit drinking 8 years ago, and I'm grateful to have gotten to experience so much of my life after being completely clean and sober for a while now. But it's because of these past addictions that I'm now extremely sensitive to the ways my body reacts to anything that creates a sort of high or similar sensation. I even have a hard time eating sugar to this day because the quick, satisfying rush that occurs feels kind of similar to taking a small hit of meth. Of course, the rush isn't the worst part, that's obviously the appealing part, it's the crash that inevitably comes after the rush that sends me spiraling. So I guess to rephrase that, I do love sugar, or at least I enjoy it briefly during the initial surge of euphoria it provides. But shortly after eating it, I start to feel absolutely terrible, almost like I'm going through micro withdrawals from meth again. It's kind of crazy to me that I still experience this when I eat foods high in processed sugar, especially if I eat them in excess or on an empty stomach. But sugar is not the only culprit when it comes to inducing a reward-like feeling in the brain. In March of 2020, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia for a job I was really excited about. But the day I arrived in Georgia was the very same day the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown occurred. So ironically, I moved across the country for an in-person job that I was never able to go into an actual office for. Instead, I was suddenly spending a lot of time in a one-bedroom apartment, and like many people, I was finding myself spending a lot of time on TikTok. This ultimately ended up leading me to getting billions of views on various social platforms and over 8 million followers on TikTok, but that's another story for a later video. What I noticed was the more time I spent scrolling on the app was that I started to sort of mentally deteriorate. way. I was gaining weight that I didn't want to be gaining. I would walk into the gym and after 15 minutes realize I had no motivation to work out. So I would leave, scrolling all the way to the car. I'd then sit in the car and sink lower and lower in my seat in a downward spiral of mental numbness, scrolling on TikTok. I was starting to feel really addicted to my phone. When I scrolled, any uncomfortable feelings I had towards things that I needed to do that day, conflicts in any of my relationships, work stresses of any kind, just disappeared. The same way they did when I did meth. It is possible that because of the pandemic, the lack of social connection might also have influenced this. As hard as I would try to establish new habits, I felt very trapped in this world of infinite scrolling I was creating. It was kind of like I was immersing myself into a virtual reality that allowed me to not have to deal with my life. I was in a part of the country where I didn't really know anybody. A lot of things were closed down, which made it even harder to go out and meet people. After several months of this, I started noticing that I was having thoughts coming to me that were saying, I haven't felt like this since I went through meth withdrawals. This kind of scared me a bit, but after doing some research, it actually begun to make sense why. Scrolling on social media triggers the reward system in the brain in a very similar way that methamphetamine unloads massive amounts of dopamine. Here's a visual to illustrate this. The figures I'm going to reference are estimates and vary based on different studies, but they're close enough to illustrate the main point. Let's say that this is a normal brain at typical baseline levels of dopamine. Let's see how different factors cause dopamine to increase. Eating food, something very important to species survival, can cause a spike in dopamine levels to jump by 50 to 100% above baseline. If those foods are sugary or high in fat, it can jump as high as 130% above baseline. Sexual activity and nicotine are both said to take dopamine even higher, around 200 to 220% above baseline. Next up is cocaine, skyrocketing dopamine to over 300% above baseline. Now for the worst one of all, methamphetamine shoots dopamine over 1200% above baseline, which is absolutely insane to think about. Now, as amazing as it might seem like that would feel, there's obviously a flip side to it. Not only does this wipe out the brain's stores of dopamine, leaving even less feel-good chemicals available for normal activities, but the brain actually starts doing something very self-destructive to cope with this. After a person's been using meth for a little while, the first thing that starts to happen is activities like eating, listening to music, going to meet up with friends, working out become less and less enjoyable each time the person is withdrawing from the drug. Then it gets worse. The brain attempts to overcompensate for this confusing overload of dopamine by actually shutting down dopamine receptors. The brain is able to recognize that this constant overload is unnecessary and creates a massive imbalance, so it literally starts attacking itself to stop it from continuing. Hence, terms like drugs kill brain cells stem from something that's actually quite literal. Furthermore, when you engage in a normal dopamine-inducing activity like exercise or eating a nutritious sandwich, dopamine is actually usually recycled after it's released. But part of the chemical process involved with using meth is such that the dopamine is not even able to be recycled and the supply quickly diminishes. This means that for a user, the world without meth starts to feel really dark and lame, exponentially faster and faster each time a person uses. Now, where does scrolling on social media fit into all this? I don't know that enough studies have been done yet to identify what percentage of dopamine above baseline is produced when scrolling on social media, but we could compare the desire to scroll on social media with similar desires to eat food, for example, and then we can start to get an idea of where it might fit into that spectrum. Now, obviously, scrolling on social media doesn't produce a massive wave of dopamine like meth does. It's clearly much more spread out, but over time, aren't the effects starting to be similar enough that it's still kind of concerning? If you've ever watched documentaries like The Social Dilemma, you might already be aware of how many millions of dollars went into designing and developing these social media apps to trigger the reward system in our brain. The colors, icons, and sound effects aren't too different than the slot machines we find in casinos, and that's on purpose. If scrolling becomes a daily habit, while it's hard to measure, it's probably fair to say that we are depleting dopamine stores daily that humans did not deplete in the world before smartphones existed. Not to mention, how many hours are we throwing away that we would be spending doing other, perhaps even more fulfilling activities? Surely, releasing dopamine for extended periods of time above the normal baseline level, like microdosing, must have a negative effect on a person's brain chemistry or feelings of well-being. And the longer a person scrolls, the more and more they may depleting from these stores, which in turn could lead to more and more aspects of life feeling less enjoyable. Now, I'm certainly not a psychologist or a neuroscientist, and this video isn't intended to diagnose or treat anyone's social media behavior. I also realize there's a fine line between labeling behaviors as addictions that some people might consider harmless entertainment. After all, aren't we told that anything can be enjoyed if it's done in moderation? Looking at some different definitions of addiction, we know that addiction is a compulsive reliance on a substance or behavior despite negative consequences, often leading to a loss of control and interference with daily life. The 12-step definition is actually really similar and describes addiction as any behavior that might cause life to feel unmanageable. I'm really curious whether people who have a past history of addiction are more affected by something like scrolling, or if everyone notices these negative effects equally. Books that I've read like Dopamine Nation make me think that someone who's already had an issue with addiction like me is going to be more sensitive to these effects. It's also difficult to measure considering people of all different ages are picking up a smartphone for the first time today. I do wonder if excessive scrolling makes people less likely to feel a desire to do things like connect with others, study, work on a house project, pursue a creative endeavor, or chase goals they once felt motivated by. After that moment I had in Atlanta, when I'd had that thought that putting my phone down after a binge of scrolling reminded me very much of meth withdrawals, I wanted to find out how long I was actually spending on my phone. I immediately went and looked at my screen time and was horrified at what I saw. It said that during the pandemic, I was spending 5 to 7 hours a day scrolling on TikTok. That's basically a full-time job. I was so horrified that I actually posted a TikTok confessing my average screen time to my followers and asked them to also share what their screen time was. Much to my non-surprise, most people shared that their screen time was actually similar to mine, and most of that time was spent on TikTok. Some people were even on TikTok over 9 hours a day. Now when I think about this, I start to feel pretty sad, especially when I consider parents who, in a moment of perhaps feeling overwhelmed or desperate, put a screen in front of their child in an attempt to occupy them. I'm not saying children should never have access to screens or that parents can't ever utilize a screen as a tool to support them during difficult times, as parenting obviously has many challenges. And as someone who's not a parent, I obviously can't fully speak to that, but let me know what you guys think in the comments. Ultimately, I think the real concern is when screen time becomes excessive, especially during the critical stages of when a child's brain is still in the process of developing. This sparks a broader conversation about our reliance on technology and whether there's a healthy limit we should recognize. At what point do we cross the threshold where the benefits of social media are outweighed by its negative side effects? When it comes to my scrolling behavior, I can say that at the time it was at its peak during the pandemic, I was also experimenting a lot. I was making a ton of videos, I was studying the algorithm, and this eventually became worthwhile as I was able to pursue my dream of being a full-time content creator. This allowed me to actually quit my day job that I moved to Georgia for, and I'm now able to create while having healthy boundaries with my phone. I actually have a screen time tracker where I track how long I'm on my phone every day, and I'm always trying to get that lower each month so I can rely on my phone less and less. When I first set out to be a full-time creator, short-form content wasn't as dominant as it is now, and I didn't realize just how much I'd be contributing to the sheer volume of content online. Over time, I've started questioning, as a creator, am I making anything meaningful or am I just adding to all the noise? I've even questioned whether creating content is ethical if it contributes to endless scrolling. But I have come to realize that social media isn't inherently bad. In fact, I do think that many people use it for good, and those who engage with boundaries can reap the benefits without as many negative side effects. What I can do is focus on my part, encouraging people to create authentically rather than just churning out mindless AI-generated content. And that's a big part of why I built my course, Viral Creator Pro. I didn't just want to teach people how to get views with gimmicks, I wanted to help people create content with purpose, content that actually resonates with their audience. There's a huge difference between AI-generated spam and authentic, engaging content that connects with an audience. The goal isn't to churn out videos just to keep up with the algorithm, it's to create something people actually care about and want to come back to your channel to see more of. And like I said, I've also had to set boundaries with my own screen time. I now keep my social media phone separate from my regular one so I'm not tempted to scroll when I'm out and about. I don't even bring a phone to the gym anymore because I know how easily I can get distracted. Instead, I log my workouts with an old-fashioned pen and paper, and honestly, I feel so much happier since making that shift. I even noticed that when I track my screen time, the lower that number gets every month, the more motivated I feel to pursue my goals. The reason this reminds me so much of my past addiction is that both meth and excessive scrolling seem to hijack the brain's pleasure center. Our brains have an amazing built-in reward system designed to be triggered by productive actions, eating food, or engaging in sexual activity to further the species. But beyond those core functions, many similar achievements can also release dopamine, like saving money, buying a house, winning a game, getting a promotion, or even checking things off a to-do list. These events motivate us to keep striving because they lead to meaningful outcomes. But meth, and in a more subtle way, endless scrolling on social media, bypass this system. They act as a sort of cheat code, giving us the rewarding feeling without actually requiring much effort. We experience a dopamine rush, but we didn't actually earn it through actions that contribute to long-term growth or survival. Problem is, the brain will always seek out the easiest path to get to that rewarding state. If it learns that it can trigger the reward system or what it perceives as progress without much real effort, it will always tend to take the shortcut over and over. I could make endless videos about the way addiction affects the brain because I find it fascinating. It's complex, but what's even more important to understand is that addiction doesn't affect everyone the same way. People who might already be struggling in life, those who are dealing with trauma, isolation, or a lack of emotional support, are going to be far more susceptible to these reward system shortcuts. There's a well-known study called Rat Park that illustrates this perfectly. Scientists found that that when rats were kept alone in isolated cages with nothing but drug-laced water, they kept drinking it obsessively. But when rats were placed in an enriched environment surrounded by other rats, toys, and plenty of food, they ignored the drugged water almost entirely. The same pattern has been observed in war veterans. Soldiers who used heroin in combat often stopped when they returned home to loving families and stable environments, while those who came back to isolation and hardship were far more likely to continue using. In other words, addiction isn't just about the substance or behavior, it's also about the environment and emotional state of the person experiencing it. People who are already fighting to just feel okay in the world are the ones who are going to be more likely to fall into these cycles, whether it's drugs, social media, or any other quick hit dopamine release. People might turn to addictions because they're exhausted by the way they feel and see no other way out. In desperation for relief, they stop thinking about long-term consequences and settle for short-term gratification instead. Breaking that cycle is hard. It takes real effort, support, and resources to address the underlying dissatisfaction that led someone there in the first place. Now, I know that not everyone can relate to using methamphetamine, but doom scrolling can be similarly destructive in its own way. If meth is like throwing a grenade at everything you've worked for, doom scrolling is more of a slow burn, gradually chipping away at your time, motivation, and mental clarity. You've probably heard the analogy of the frog in a pot of cool water. If the heat is turned up slowly, the frog doesn't notice it's in danger and actually won't jump out of the water, even when it starts boiling. That's kind of how excessive scrolling works. It might not hit all at once, but over time it drains your energy, disrupts your focus, and leaves you feeling completely empty. For me, meth was like being thrown straight into boiling water, and I wanted to get out quick because I knew something was wrong immediately. The spike of dopamine was so intense that within 2 weeks, I was actually telling my friends I needed help and I wanted to go to rehab. But some of them just shook their heads and said, "You don't need to go to rehab, you just need to stop doing it." And that made getting out of it even harder. It took me over a year to actually quit because of how addicted I was. What's wild though is that I felt such a similar withdrawal effect when I tried cutting back on scrolling in 2020. I know that it might not seem as extreme, but both meth and social media addiction deplete the brain's pleasure center, making normal life feel dull in comparison. For some reason, this topic always reminds me of the Dementors in Harry Potter. Both experiences made me feel like the joy was being sucked out of my life, like I'd never be cheerful again. For those who create content and use scrolling as a way to research, I think there's definitely value in that. Social media is an incredible tool. It connects us, it inspires creativity, and it can open doors to amazing opportunities. And when used responsibly, the benefits can outweigh the downsides. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever received is this: spend more time creating than consuming. Because when we fall into the trap of endless consumption, it can lead to comparison, self-doubt, and even a loss of identity as a creator. That said, I have met people who claim that scrolling through videos makes them happier and has no negative effects. I don't know if that's always true or if it's just denial, but I am genuinely curious, how do you feel after spending your time scrolling? Does it leave you motivated and excited, or do you feel drained and unproductive? And what do you think is the ideal amount of time to spend on social media or phone games each day to enjoy the benefits without feeling depleted? Let me know in the comments what you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more content on being a creator while staying mindful of how consuming content affects the way we create.